Now, the session is with my very dear friend from US, Dr. Daniel Markey. Daniel Markey is a senior expert on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace, where his work focuses on US policy in South Asia, especially US-India relations, regional relations, and China-South Asia relations. Earlier, he served as Senior Research Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. He participated in the second edition of Leaders in Islamabad physically, and we hosted Daniel in Islamabad for 3 days. Later, he also participated in various conversations. So Daniel, welcome from US and greetings from Islamabad, Pakistan. And hope to see you soon sometime physically also. I'm really grateful to you. So the topic for Daniel's conversation is the emerging geopolitical scenario. He will talk about 10 minutes followed by few question answers. Over to you, Daniel.
Great, thanks for the welcome and the introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to join you again. I only wish that I could be there in person, but hopefully we'll get to that sooner and not later. Yeah, so I do have a little bit of time, and I wanted to talk about sort of the new geopolitics of this era. And I really think that, we can always talk about how, our current moment is different from what has come before. But more and more it feels like we're at a crossroads internationally, geopolitically, that things really have changed. And as I look back over my career and I look back over the past 20, 25 years or so, I think we are at a defining moment. And it certainly looks that way sitting here in Washington, D.C., where I think there is a new consensus that has emerged in terms of how to think about the world, how to think about the United States' place in the world. And this new consensus really situates us in a broad geopolitical competition, chiefly with China. Now, it's not so simple as that, but if one were to attempt to find the organizing principle of the Biden administration's view of the world, I think that beginning with China would be the right place to start. And it's important to put that into context, because for at least the past 20 years, we are now just after the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda. For at least the past 20 years, we have been living in the post-9/11 era. And now I think that the Biden administration certainly wishes to turn the page on that era, to end that chapter definitively, one way or another, and to shift to something different. And, I think we're also sitting here at a time when some important speeches have just been made at the United Nations General Assembly, both by Xi Jinping of China and by President Biden of the United States. And they couldn't be more different in some important ways in their depictions of what the current era looks like, but also of what these two important nations view as their vision of the future and of a world order. And both of them have compelling attraction, but also some important criticism that can be leveled against them. Certainly when President Xi unveiled his vision for the current and future world order, it begins in most ways with economic development and with a claim that China has unlocked the potential of economic development, not just for over 1 billion Chinese citizens, but that its formula for economic development is one that can be shared by billions of others around the world. And if only other countries would follow China's example and China's lead and increasingly buy into a Chinese-led system, then they too can enjoy the prosperity that so many Chinese have started to enjoy over the past generation. Now, inherent in this view, this China model, is also a critique of the American model. And while I tend to believe that President Xi's critique of the United States is overly simplistic and in many ways unfair, I think it will have some takers in parts of the world. And certainly at some level, his criticism is that democracy, at least American-style democracy, is not for everyone. And beyond that, that what America purports to do, being a champion of liberal world order, and what America actually does, which is an overly militarized and aggressive approach to the world, is something that other countries will find unappealing and even dangerous. Now, that's, as I say, very much in contrast with the vision of the world order presented by President Biden, who, near the end of his speech at the UN, and certainly in many other contexts of recent speeches that he's given, has stressed that he wants to see the end of the so-called forever wars of the 9/11 era, that he has wanted to end the military-first application of American power overseas, particularly in the Middle East, and now most recently in Afghanistan, and that he wants to focus the weight and priority of American initiatives in the international system toward diplomacy, whether that's bilateral diplomacy, state-to-state diplomacy, or multilateral diplomacy, or what is increasingly called plurilateral diplomacy, that is, within small groups of like-minded states. And this is, of course, not just a turn away from 20 years of American sort of militarized approach to the world, certainly criticized in many quarters, including within the United States itself. But it's also a turn away from his immediate predecessor, Donald Trump, who clearly stressed what he described as an America first vision of the world and of America's place within it. President Biden couldn't be any more different by stressing the importance of institutions like the United Nations, by stressing the United States' desire to partner with other states around the world, again, in variety of settings. And he went on to explain some of that in his speech. But at the core of it, the real distinction between Biden's vision of the world order and Xi's vision of the world order, or the American vision and the Chinese vision, at least from Biden's perspective, has something to do with how you get to human flourishing. How do you achieve not just economic growth, but the growth in opportunity for citizens of countries around the world? And from his perspective, and for many liberal democratic internationalists inside the United States, the best way to accomplish that is by adherence to liberal values, by championing those values overseas and living up to them better at home, by recognizing that, as he said, no democracy is perfect, but, and I'll quote, he says, democracy remains the best tool we have to unleash our full human potential. So clearly, we have a Chinese vision that stresses economic development, Chinese assistance for economic development with no strings attached, a China model that allows for political repression, undemocratic rule, and no particular emphasis on democracy as a solution to political problems, and an American vision that serves really as a desire to champion, to defend democratic practices and liberal values at home and abroad. Now, I should also be clear that the Biden administration wants to be quite different in the way that it goes about defending democracy or defending liberal world order very differently than, say, the George W. Bush administration did. Because if we look back and recall in the early post-9/11 period and the war in Iraq, much of what the Bush administration saw as the American capacity to expand and broaden what it defined or described as the freedom agenda came through the application of military force, through war. Again, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, a sense that the spread of American values could be done through the spread of the American military. And the Biden administration wants to reverse that and to suggest that in some ways, even the retreat of American military presence abroad can free up societies in ways that will help and ultimately advance that agenda. Now, this is obviously combined for the Biden administration with a number of other initiatives, which also are not military in purpose. And the principal one, the one that I think gets the headline attention or ought to, has to do with COVID and with a COVID vaccine initiative and a new American effort to broaden access to vaccines around the world by doubling the number of those jabs, so to speak, that will be made available by the United States. But it doesn't end there. There's obviously a new focus on climate change with former Secretary Kerry leading the charge in the climate summit, and through a variety of other initiatives, again, all focused on things like technology, innovation, and non-military efforts. And again, a lot of this is driven by this geopolitical competition with China, and we shouldn't overlook that. Certainly an announcement last week on a new submarine deal with Australia and a new defense pact between Australia, the United States, and the UK is a good example of something that is aimed at competing with China and does have a military component to it. But this week, we will also see the first in-person meeting of the Quad leaders, that is the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, here in Washington, D.C. They will all meet in person. And that has a less militarized component to it. I think we're likely to see an emphasis on technology, again, on COVID, on vaccine diplomacy, in ways that are intended to suggest that these types of partnerships can do good for the world in a less militarized way, but are also clearly defined in opposition to China and to China's vision of the world order. Now, let me just say also that a lot of these changes are not simply driven by the Biden administration alone, because I think there are many outside the United States who see this kind of remarkable shift from Trump to Biden as reflecting simply one presidency after the other, and they can be forgiven for wondering whether, this kind of change will happen again and again. The United States will vacillate, seesaw-like, between different extremes. But I would say that a number of these changes are actually reflect an underlying American broad popular consensus that has, over the past 20 years, certainly tired of seeing the United States military at war in other countries, and was broadly supportive of the U.S. military withdrawal, certainly from Afghanistan, if not in the way that it was done, but in the fact that it was being done at all. And so in that respect, Biden and Trump before him, and even to some extent Obama in his later part of his presidency, all perceived a need for the United States military to withdraw from Afghanistan and to turn the page and to shift to other global efforts. Now, I would close my opening remarks simply by observing that many of you are sitting in Pakistan, and one of the real questions facing you will be, as you look to this new world order that in many ways, at least in the United States and in China, seems to be defined by the competition between a global superpower and a rising superpower, where Pakistan will fit into this. Which of the visions, as presented imperfectly, but very distinctly differently by President Xi on the one hand, or President Biden on the other, which of these is more appealing to Pakistan? Which of these applies to Pakistan's purposes more directly? And how Pakistan will navigate the challenge of weaving within this new world order is really the thing that I would expect will be on Pakistani minds, just as it is on our minds here in Washington. So let me close there. Again, thanks for the opportunity to address you. I look forward to a couple of questions, and I apologize that I'll have to take off in a few minutes.
Very good opening comments, Dan. My first question, very brief time, there are multiple questions, but you are actually committed for the next assignment, and we are also running short of time, so one or two questions I will ask you. Is the American retreat from Afghanistan a reflection of the overall global American foreign policy shift? America's focus seems to be on its commitments to Israel in the Middle East and containment of China in Asia. How do we see America's involvement in Afghanistan and Pakistan moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing to appreciate would be that at a broad strategic level, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was intended, as I say, to turn the page and to shift American priority militarily, certainly, and even at a intelligence level, away from Afghanistan, from counterterrorism, and more toward this competition with China. So that's the first thing, at a broad level. But we also need to keep in mind that the withdrawal from Afghanistan did not go the way that the Biden administration anticipated that it would.
Yes.
This is a reality. It has already been much messier, and what has been left behind is much uglier from a U.S. perspective than what was expected. Frankly speaking, I think the United States and the Biden administration anticipated that they could leave behind an Afghan government that would at least negotiate its way to an inclusive state with which the United States would continue to have a diplomatic relationship for the foreseeable future. And that has not happened. So what is ultimately unraveled here is a bigger mess, and one that I think is going to be harder. You know, despite what the Biden administration wants to end that chapter, the chapter won't let itself be ended. And this is going to take longer to resolve, if it can be resolved at all.
Thank you. The Europeans and NATO behind closed doors are very critical of the U.S. withdrawal. Many are questioning the very purpose of NATO, given that the United States seems to act unilaterally when it suits them. What is the future of NATO in your opinion, Dan? And this is a European military alliance on the cards?
Yeah, I think, look, this is a long story of our NATO partners being frustrated at times with the United States, and the United States being at times frustrated with our NATO partners. We'll all recall that certainly the Trump administration, but also administrations before it, were frustrated that our NATO partners were not paying their fair share to the alliance, that much of the burden of the alliance was falling on American taxpayers. So there have been rifts before. Certainly, there's not just frustration in Europe about what's happened in Afghanistan, but frustration and angst, real tragic response here in Washington to what happened to Afghanistan and in Afghanistan, and the policies that have unraveled in unanticipated ways. So it's not surprising that we're hearing that grumbling. I would just say that if you look at the future of NATO, there's one word that should be kept in mind, which tends to be Russia. The emphasis of NATO has always been Europe first, and the question is how best to secure Europe from aggression from Russia. And that's where I think the emphasis of NATO has already shifted in the recent past to questions about Ukraine and so on, and where I anticipate a lot of the focus will be. And yes, I think some of the frustration in Europe with the United States will dissipate. The rest may incline Europeans to take up a greater share of the burden on their own. But we'll see. That's been something that's been on the cards for a long time and hasn't yet materialized.
Thank you. And my last question is, what can be done to bolster the U.S.-Pakistani relationship and move it away from security and counterterrorism cooperation into a deeper, more enriching relationship?
Well, I think I have two answers to that. The first is, in order for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to focus more on economics, on, as the Chinese would say, win-win solutions, on business and so on, Pakistan's own leaders, and in particular Pakistan's business leaders, need to continue and to expand their effort to make a case to American business leaders that Pakistan is a good place to work in and with. So far that has been a tall order, and I would say many American business have been frustrated with Pakistan. And so the burden lies then on the Pakistani side to reinvigorate that effort. On the other broader sense, I would say for the U.S. government, the U.S. government has never been good at promoting business-to-business relations in any other country. It's really in a different game altogether. And in terms of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, I think it's tough times. And I think the best thing for the government-to-government relationship right now would be to narrow its aperture, to narrow its focus on areas where we actually do agree. And some of those do continue to be on the security front, and where we have shared enemies in groups like ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda, where we need to continue our narrow cooperation. And that may be a foundation for further expansion of our relationship, but it will take time. This is a difficult moment in U.S.-Pakistan relations, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. But those are the ways that I think we can begin to get back to a more normal relationship bilaterally.
Thank you. One last question also. Actually, you participated in the Afghanistan conference when we hosted the first Afghanistan conference, and later we hosted the second Afghanistan conference. So in both editions of Afghanistan conference last month, I asked one question from 4 persons. First time with Dr. Shiri Mazari, the Federal Minister for Human Rights in Pakistan, and also Senator Sherry Rahman, who is the chairperson for Foreign Relations Committee, Senate of Pakistan. And later in the second edition, I asked the same question from General Zubair Mahmood Hayat, who is former Chairman Joint Chief of Staff Committee, and also Admiral William Owens, the former Deputy Joint Chief of Staff Committee of USA. The question I am asking you, the same question: what lessons can the world learn from America's war in Afghanistan? What is your view on this?
Sadly, a 20-year war comes with 20 years of lessons. And I think it is too simple to unfortunately, to boil down one war into just rote lessons. Most of the lessons were a simple lesson, but most of the lessons that I focus on tend to be about American foreign policy. And so when I speak to American audiences, one of the things I would say is that there has always been in Afghanistan a mismatch between America's attention to the war as we gave it and the attention that was necessary to actually win the war, if that was possible at all. And we have tried, I think for 20 years, to fight, we the United States, to fight this war on our own terms, to make deadlines that fall on the American political calendar, or to set resources basically driven by other American calculations, including the ongoing, at the time, war in Iraq as well. So we haven't really focused on the war in Afghanistan as the war in Afghanistan, and this is not the way to fight and win a war. The United States can do so when we are convinced that it's in our supreme national interests, and we are willing to dedicate the attention and the focus that a war like this deserves. But I'm afraid that although we fought it, it's now our longest war, we never fought it as our top priority, except maybe for the first year or so. And then we drifted into other things. Can't fight a war and drift, even if you're a superpower. So that's one lesson that I would point out.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, and I'm grateful to you. You always participate in our conferences, and we will continue. And next time, hopefully, we will host you in Islamabad or in other part of the Pakistan. I'm again grateful to you, Dan. Thank you.
That would be wonderful. Thanks. It's always great to see you, and I appreciate having a chance to speak with your audience. Always a great audience.
Second time you participated in the Leaders in Islamabad Business Summit. So thanks to Readle platform also. Thank you.
Great.
So ladies and gentlemen, this was our exclusive session with Daniel Markey on the emerging geopolitical scenario. And over to Rabia now.